3 generations of his family ran that prosecutor's office. 87 consecutive years. He thought he was untouchable in the low country of South Carolina. Miles ghost hunter here. Alex Murdaugh didn't count on one thing, that his son, 4 minutes before the end, hit record on his phone. The call came in at 10:07 on the night of June 7, 2021. A man screaming into a 911 dispatcher. His voice was broken. His breathing was ragged. He said his wife and his son had been shot. He said he had just come home and found them lying beside the dog kennels. He said there was blood everywhere. He said he didn't know what to do. That man was Alex Murdaugh, 53 years old, partner at the most prestigious law firm in Hampton County, South Carolina, son of Randolph Murdaugh Jr., grandson of Randolph Murdaugh Sr., heir to a dynasty that had controlled the prosecutor's office of the 14th Judicial Circuit since 1920. 87 consecutive years, 3 generations, one family deciding who got charged, who got prosecuted, and who walked free in 5 counties of coastal South Carolina. The 911 operator tried to keep him on the line. She asked him if anyone was breathing. He said no. She asked him if he had touched the bodies. He said he had checked for a pulse. She asked him where the shooter was. He said he had no idea. She asked him if he was safe. He said he didn't know anymore. The first deputy arrived at the Moselle estate 17 minutes later. Moselle was a 6,000-acre hunting property the Murdaugh family had owned for decades. A massive tract of pine forest, marshland, and hunting trails in rural Colleton County. The main house sat at the end of a long dirt road. The dog kennels were another quarter-mile past the house, down a wooded path, in a clearing where the family kept their hunting dogs. That is where the deputy found them. Margaret Branstetter Murdaugh, 52 years old, mother of 2, wife of Alex. She was lying face down in the dirt beside the kennels. She had been shot multiple times with what would later be identified as a .300 blackout caliber rifle. Most likely an AR-15 style platform. The pattern of wounds indicated that the shooter had stood over her as she tried to crawl away. Paul Terry Murdaugh, 22 years old, college student, younger son of Alex and Maggie. He was inside the feed room next to the kennels. He had been killed by 2 shotgun blasts. The first shot had struck him in the chest. The second had struck him in the head. He was still holding his cell phone when the deputy arrived. Alex Murdaugh was standing nearby. His shirt was clean. His pants were clean. His hands were clean. He was wearing the same clothing he had put on that morning. A light-colored button-down shirt and khaki pants. The deputy would later testify that there was not a single visible drop of blood on Alex Murdaugh anywhere. This was the first thing that did not make sense. Alex claimed he had checked both bodies for a pulse. He claimed he had rolled Paul over. He claimed he had knelt beside Maggie. The blood at the scene was extensive. Arterial spray covered the feed room walls. Maggie's blood had pooled in the dirt around her body. The dogs in the kennels were coated with blood spatter. Every crime scene technician who testified later said the same thing. It was impossible to be at that scene, to touch either body, and come away clean. But Alex Murdaugh was clean. The second thing that did not make sense was the weapons. Paul had been killed with a shotgun. Maggie had been killed with a rifle. 2 different weapons, 2 different ammunition types. In cases of family annihilation, a husband killing his wife and children, investigators almost always find a single weapon. One weapon, used quickly, in rapid succession. 2 weapons suggested either 2 shooters or a single shooter who had planned the sequence carefully enough to have both weapons ready at the scene. Both weapons, by the way, were never recovered. They simply disappeared that night. The third thing that did not make sense was Alex's story about where he had been. He told the responding deputies that he had driven to visit his mother, Libby Murdaugh, at her home in Almeda, about 20 minutes away. His mother had advanced Alzheimer's disease. She was cared for around the clock by a nurse named Shelley Smith. Alex claimed he had arrived at his mother's house sometime after 9 in the evening, stayed for about 45 minutes, and driven back to Moselle to discover the bodies. Shelley Smith gave a different story. She told investigators that Alex had shown up at the house sometime between 9:15 and 9:30. He stayed for only 15 to 20 minutes. His behavior was strange. He was fidgety. He kept looking at his phone. He barely interacted with his mother. He told Shelley multiple times that he had been there for longer than he actually had been. He specifically asked her to remember that he had been there from 8:30 onward. She refused. She told him what she had told investigators. She had seen him arrive. She knew what time it was. This was Alex Murdaugh's first attempt to build an alibi. And it failed, because the nurse refused to lie for him. Now, before we go any further, Miles Ghost Hunter wants you to understand who this man was. Because to understand how a prosecutor becomes a murderer, you have to understand the world he came from. Randolph Murdaugh Sr., Alex's grandfather, became the solicitor of the 14th Judicial Circuit of South Carolina in 1920. A solicitor in South Carolina is what most states call a district attorney or prosecuting attorney. It is an elected position. The solicitor decides which cases get prosecuted and which ones quietly disappear. Randolph Sr. held the office for 46 years, from 1920 until his death in a train accident in 1940. His son, Randolph Murdaugh Jr., known in Hampton County as Buster, took over the office after his father's death. Buster served as solicitor for 46 years, from 1940 until 1986. He prosecuted hundreds of cases. He was a legend in the Low Country. He was known for wearing seersucker suits in the summer and intimidating defense attorneys into plea deals. His son, Randolph Murdaugh III, Alex's father, succeeded him as solicitor in 1986. Randolph III held the office until 2006. 46 years of grandfather, 46 years of father, 20 years of son. For 87 consecutive years, the prosecutor's office of the 14th Judicial Circuit of South Carolina was run by a Murdaugh. No other family in American legal history has ever controlled a single prosecutor's office for that long. And alongside the prosecutor's office, the Murdaugh family built a civil law firm. They called it Peters, Murdaugh, Parker, Eltsroth and Dietrich, usually shortened to PMPED. It became the most powerful plaintiff's law firm in the Low Country. If you were injured in a truck accident, killed in a workplace incident, or harmed by a defective product in 5 counties of coastal South Carolina, the Murdaugh firm represented you. Their settlements averaged in the millions. Their contingency fees made the partners rich. Alex Murdaugh joined the family firm in the mid-1990s. He was a big personality, 6 feet 4 inches tall, red hair, freckled skin, the kind of good old boy charisma that played well in front of Southern juries. He was never the smartest lawyer in the room, but he was the most likable. Clients trusted him. Opposing counsel underestimated him. Judges gave him every benefit of the doubt. He married Maggie Brandstetter in 1993. She came from a wealthy family in Summerton, South Carolina. She was elegant, soft-spoken, devoted to her children. They had 2 sons, Richard Alexander Murdaugh Jr., known as Buster after his great-grandfather, and Paul Terry Murdaugh, born in 1999. For years, the family lived the classic low-country aristocratic life: hunting trips, Christmas parties, duck blinds at Door Mallory Beach. And what happened to her that night became the beginning of the end for the Murdaugh dynasty, and the direct trigger for what would happen at those dog kennels 2 years later. On February 23, 2019, Paul Murdaugh, 19 years old at the time, took his father's boat out on the waterways near Paris Island, South Carolina. He had been drinking since the afternoon. His blood alcohol level that night, by the time the accident happened, was 0.236, nearly 3 times the legal limit for an adult. And this was a 19-year-old who legally could not drink at all. There were 6 young people on the boat. Paul's girlfriend, Morgan Doughty, his best friend, Connor Cook, Anthony Cook and his girlfriend, Mallory Beach, Miley Altman, and Paul himself at the wheel. They had been to an oyster roast, They had stopped at multiple bars. Paul had used his older brother Buster's identification to buy alcohol, a fake ID that the store clerks later said he used constantly. By the time they left the last bar and got back on the boat, Paul could barely stand. Witnesses on other boats that night said Paul was driving erratically, weaving, shouting, standing up at the wheel. Around 2 in the morning, Paul slammed the boat into a piling of the Archers Creek Bridge at full throttle. The impact was catastrophic. Everyone on board was thrown violently. Connor Cook was knocked unconscious. Morgan Doughty's jaw was broken. Miley Altman suffered a fractured skull. Mallory Beach was thrown into the dark water. She was 19 years old. Her body was not found for 7 days. When the Coast Guard and the local sheriff's department arrived at the scene of the accident, something strange happened. Paul Murdaugh was not questioned at length. His blood was not drawn for several hours. The investigation was handled sloppily, almost deliberately. Officers on the scene later testified that they were told, repeatedly, that this was a Murdaugh boy, that there would be consequences if they pushed too hard. And who showed up at the scene that night, acting as if he were in charge? Alex Murdaugh, not as a parent, not as a concerned father, as a lawyer. He positioned himself between Paul and investigators. He answered questions on Paul's behalf. He coached his son's friends on what to say and what not to say. Morgan Doughty, Paul's girlfriend, later testified that Alex told her to tell investigators that Connor Cook had been driving the boat, not Paul. Paul was eventually charged, months later, with boating under the influence causing death and boating under the influence causing great bodily injury. But he never stood trial, because 3 years later, he was dead at the dog kennels of Moselle. In the meantime, the Beach family filed a civil lawsuit. They sued Paul Murdaugh. They sued Alex Murdaugh as the boat's owner. They sued the convenience store that had sold alcohol to an underage Paul. They sued for wrongful death. The lawsuit was filed by a lawyer named Mark Tinsley. And Mark Tinsley, slowly, began to realize something unusual about Alex Murdaugh. Alex had told everyone, including his law partners, including his wife, including Mark Tinsley's deposition team, that his personal net worth was modest. He claimed most of his wealth was tied up in the family property. He claimed he couldn't possibly pay a large settlement. He claimed he was, essentially, broke. Mark Tinsley did not believe him. Tinsley spent 2 years preparing for the financial disclosure phase of the lawsuit. He hired forensic accountants. He subpoenaed banks. He requested Alex Murdaugh's complete financial records going back a decade. And the hearing for that financial disclosure was scheduled for June 10th, 2021, 3 days after June 7th, 3 days after Maggie and Paul were shot at the dog kennels. Understand what this means. The deadline for Alex Murdaugh to hand over his complete financial records, every bank account, every transaction, every hidden asset, was 3 days away when his wife and son were killed. And if he had handed over those records, Mark Tinsley would have discovered what investigators would eventually discover anyway. Alex Murdaugh had been stealing for more than a decade. From his law partners, from his clients, from widows, from orphans, from a quadriplegic man who needed the money for medical care, from the family of his own housekeeper who had died on his property. The total by the end was over $8.7 million. So when the first deputy rolled up to Moselle on the night of June 7th and looked at that clean shirt and looked at those 2 weapons and looked at that shaky alibi about visiting mother, there was already a motive buried underneath all of it. A man whose entire financial empire was 3 days from collapse. A man whose entire family reputation was about to be destroyed. A man who had spent his whole life learning how the criminal justice system worked and who knew, better than almost anyone else in South Carolina, how to direct an investigation away from himself. But Alex Murdaugh had not counted on his son's phone. Paul Murdaugh was a content creator, in a small way. He made videos for his friends constantly. He documented his life on Snapchat and iPhone videos. On the evening of June 7th, around 8:44 in the evening, Paul recorded a short video at the dog kennels. He was trying to help a friend named Rogan Gibson diagnose a problem with a dog's tail. Rogan could not be there in person, so Paul recorded a video, 45 seconds long, showing the dog and talking about what was wrong. Paul did not save the video. He recorded it, tried to send it, and it was captured in his phone's cache. For months, that phone sat in an evidence locker, locked, password protected. Investigators could not get into it. Paul had used a complex alphanumeric passcode, and standard law enforcement unlocking tools could not crack it. But somewhere in the background of that 45-second video, clearly audible to anyone who listened, were three voices. Paul's voice, narrating the dog, Maggie's voice, calling out to someone, and a third voice, a male voice, deep, distinctive, speaking softly, but clearly enough to be identified by anyone who had ever met him. It was Alex Murdaugh, at the kennels, at 8:44 in the evening. 5 minutes before investigators believed Maggie and Paul were killed, the man who had told police, under oath, that he had not been at the kennels that evening, was on an audio recording at the kennels that evening, and the recording had been made by one of the victims 4 minutes before he died. When investigators finally cracked Paul's phone, months later, with help from digital forensics specialists who used a specialized brute force tool and played that audio, they knew Alex Murdaugh was going down. But he did not know yet that they had broken into the phone, and he did not know that they had heard his voice on it. So Alex kept lying. On September 4th, 2021, 3 months after the killings, Alex Murdaugh did something that shocked even the investigators who had already suspected him. He staged his own murder. Here is what happened. Alex was facing pressure from every direction. His law firm partners had discovered the financial theft and confronted him. They had told him to resign from the firm, which he did on September 3rd. That same day, they began preparing to report him to the South Carolina bar for disbarment and to the state law enforcement for prosecution. His wife and younger son were dead. His older son, Buster, was grieving and starting to ask questions. The civil case from the Beach family was still moving forward. Multiple clients whose money he had stolen were beginning to demand accounting. Alex Murdaugh's world was collapsing on every side at once, so he called an old client and sometimes drug dealer named Curtis Edward Smith, known locally as Cousin Eddie. Smith was a distant relative, not really a cousin, but connected through the sprawling family networks of Hampton County. For years, Alex had been writing Curtis Smith checks. The checks totaled over $2.4 million. Alex had claimed, in firm records, that the payments were for various services. The truth was, Curtis Smith was Alex's drug supplier. Alex had been addicted to opioids for over 20 years. On September 4th, Alex called Smith and told him to meet him on Salkehatchie Road, a remote stretch of rural highway in Hampton County. Alex's plan, as he later admitted in court, was this. Curtis Smith would shoot Alex in the head. Alex would die. His son, Buster, the only surviving son, would collect $10 million in life insurance money, which was exempt from the civil judgments that were coming for the estate. Alex Murdaugh was planning to die to protect the remainder of his family's money from the victims he had stolen it from. But the plan went wrong immediately. Curtis Smith showed up. Alex was on the side of the road, supposedly changing a tire. Smith fired a shot. The bullet grazed Alex's skull but did not kill him. Alex was rushed to the hospital, and within 48 hours, the entire scheme unraveled. Alex had been caught on highway surveillance footage. Smith was arrested. Smith told investigators the whole story, that Alex had begged him to do it, that this had been Alex's idea, that Alex had promised to pay him. On September 6th, 2 days after the failed suicide scheme, Alex Murdaugh was admitted to a detox facility. On September 14th, he was charged with insurance fraud, filing a false police report, and conspiracy. In the weeks that followed, he was charged with dozens of financial crimes stemming from the stolen client funds. And then, in July 2022, came the charge that changed everything. 2 counts of murder. Maggie Murdaugh and Paul Murdaugh, his wife and his younger son. Alex pleaded not guilty. The trial began on January 23, 2023, in Walterboro, South Carolina, Colleton County. The courtroom was presided over by Judge Clifton Newman, a respected veteran jurist whom Alex Murdaugh had personally appeared before many times as a defense attorney. The lead prosecutor was Creighton Waters, a senior assistant attorney general for South Carolina. Quiet, methodical, a man who did not grandstand and who had spent 18 months building a case with absolutely no room for error. The things were revenge for the Mallory Beach boating accident. They suggested, without evidence, that some unknown person, angry about Paul's killing of Mallory Beach, had tracked him to Moselle and killed him and his mother. They argued that Alex was an imperfect husband, an imperfect father, an addict, a thief, but not a murderer. For 6 weeks, the prosecution called 75 witnesses, crime scene investigators, forensic pathologists, ballistics experts, financial investigators, former clients, former law partners. And at the absolute center of the case, the audio from Paul Murdaugh's phone, the 45-second video of a dog, the 3 voices audible on the recording, the voice experts who identified the third voice, beyond reasonable doubt, as Alex Murdaugh. And then, in a move that stunned everyone, Alex Murdaugh took the witness stand in his own defense. Criminal defendants rarely testify. The risk is enormous. Once you take the stand, you are subject to cross-examination. Every lie you have ever told can be thrown in your face. Every inconsistency is magnified. Most defense attorneys would rather lose a case than put their client on the stand. Alex Murdaugh insisted on testifying. He was the ultimate Southern lawyer. He believed, at his core, that he could charm any jury, that his folksy low-country drawl and his tearful explanations would win them over the way it had won over juries for decades. He was wrong. Under direct examination by Jim Griffin, Alex admitted for the first time, under oath, that he had been at the dog kennels on the night of June 7th. He had lied to police. He had lied to his surviving son. He had lied to everyone for nearly 2 years. He explained the lie by saying he was in the grip of paranoia from his opioid addiction. He said he was afraid investigators would blame him. He said he had panicked. He admitted stealing millions of dollars from his law firm clients. He admitted the failed suicide plot. He admitted lying on insurance forms. He admitted everything, except the murders. He wept on the stand. He told the jury he loved Maggie and Paul more than anything in the world. He said he would never, could never, have harmed them. He looked at each juror and begged them to believe him. And then Creighton Waters stood up for cross-examination. The cross-examination lasted parts of 2 days. Waters was methodical, devastating. He walked Alex through every lie, one at a time. He played the audio from Paul's phone again and again. He pointed out the exact words Alex had used, the exact tone of his voice. He forced Alex to admit, on the stand, that he had been at the kennels at 8:44, contradicting 2 years of sworn statements to investigators. He walked Alex through the financial crimes, showing how the lawsuit deadline of June 10th lined up with the killings of June 7th. He forced Alex to admit the money motive. He forced Alex to admit that his entire life was about to collapse on the morning of June 7th. And at the end of the cross-examination, the jury had seen what every investigator had seen. A man who lied constantly. A man who lied even when the truth would have served him better. A man who could not be trusted about anything. On March 2, 2023, the jury retired to deliberate. The case had consumed 6 weeks, 75 witnesses, thousands of pages of evidence. The fate of the most powerful family in the Low Country hung in the balance. The jury returned in 3 hours. 3 hours. For a double murder case with a 26-year-old power dynasty at stake and a 6-week trial behind it, 3 hours is astonishingly fast. It is the kind of deliberation time that happens when jurors agree immediately and spend most of their time just organizing the paperwork. The 4 persons stood. The courtroom went silent. Count 1. The murder of Margaret Brandstetter Murdaugh. Guilty. Count 2. The murder of Paul Terry Murdaugh. Guilty. Alex Murdaugh showed no reaction. His surviving son, Buster, lowered his head. His law firm partners, several of whom attended every day of the trial, sat in stunned silence. The following morning, Judge Clifton Newman sentenced Alex Murdaugh to 2 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. In his sentencing remarks, Judge Newman said something that no lawyer in South Carolina had ever expected to hear spoken to a member of this family. He said, "It might not have been you. It might have been the monster you become when you take 15, 20, 30 opioid pills. Maybe you become another person. I have seen that kind of thing happen." And then later, Alex was sentenced separately to 27 additional years in federal prison for 22 financial crimes: the stolen client funds, the insurance fraud, the tax evasion, the money laundering. But the story did not end there. In September 2023, 6 months after the conviction, a story broke in South Carolina media. The court stenographer during the Murdaugh murder trial, a woman named Rebecca "Becky" Hill, was accused of improperly influencing the jury. Witnesses came forward, claiming that during the trial, Hill had approached jurors in hallways and during breaks. She had allegedly told them not to be fooled by Alex Murdaugh's testimony. She had allegedly pressured them toward a guilty verdict. The motive, investigators came to believe, was that Hill had been writing a book about the trial. She wanted a guilty verdict for her book to sell. Dick Harpootlian and Jim Griffin filed an emergency motion for a new trial. They argued that jury tampering, even by a court officer, required a complete retrial of the case. For months, the legal world watched closely. If the motion succeeded, Alex Murdaugh would face a second trial for the murders of his wife and son. His conviction would be thrown out. The most famous criminal case in South Carolina history would start over. In January 2024, a special hearing was held. Multiple jurors testified. Some confirmed Hill had spoken to them inappropriately. Others said she had not influenced their verdict. The South Carolina Supreme Court ultimately ruled that while Hill's behavior had been inappropriate, the evidence against Alex Murdaugh was so overwhelming. The audio recording, the financial motive, the cover-up attempts, that any juror hearing the evidence would have voted guilty regardless. The motion for a new trial was denied. Rebecca Hill resigned in disgrace. She was later charged with perjury and obstruction of justice. Her book was pulled from publication. Alex Murdaugh remained in prison. The dynasty that had ruled the 14th Judicial Circuit of South Carolina for 87 years collapsed in 32 months. Paul and Maggie murdered in June 2021. The staged suicide in September 2021. The financial crimes charged in fall 2021. The murder charges filed in July 2022. The conviction in March 2023. The sentencing in April 2023. The jury tampering ruling in January 2024. Alex Murdaugh now sits in the Kirkland Correctional Institution near Columbia, South Carolina, a maximum security facility. He is held in a protected unit because of the notoriety of his case and because in the general prison population, he would likely be killed. As a former prosecutor, he had sent dozens of men in South Carolina prisons to the places where he now lives. His surviving son, Buster Murdaugh, has struggled publicly. He has given occasional interviews. He has maintained his father's innocence. He has tried to rebuild a life in a state where every store clerk and every waitress recognizes his last name. The law firm, Peters, Murdaugh, Parker, Eltsroth and Dietrich, removed the Murdaugh name from its title within weeks of Alex's arrest. It now operates under a different brand. The stolen client funds have been largely repaid through the firm's insurance, the South Carolina Bar Foundation, and the seizure of Alex Murdaugh's remaining assets. The families of the widows, the orphans, and the quadriplegic man whose settlements Alex stole have received compensation, though nothing can return the years they spent without the money they needed. Curtis Smith, the failed hitman from the staged suicide, was sentenced to 20 years in prison. And Mallory Beach, the 19-year-old girl whose death in the boating accident started the entire chain of events, lies in her grave in Hampton County. Her family believes, quietly, that she was the first victim of the Murdaugh dynasty, that everything that happened afterward was set in motion by the decision to protect Paul from the consequences of her death. 87 years of power, 4 minutes of recording, 3 hours of deliberation. That is what it took to destroy a dynasty that 3 generations of lawyers thought was invincible. One man, the 4th generation, made one mistake. He underestimated his own son. He assumed Paul was a feckless, alcoholic boy who could not threaten him. He forgot that Paul was holding a phone. He forgot that phones record everything around them. Miles Ghost Hunter has told you this story because the Murdaugh case contains a lesson that every other criminal we will cover in this series missed in their own way. You can control the courthouse. You can control the investigators. You can control your wife and your law partners and your neighbors and your servants. But you cannot control a recording that has already been made. Evidence, once it exists, is patient. It waits in a locker, behind a password, for however long it takes for the truth to find it. Next week, a woman in a Texas death row cell, convicted for the murders of her own 2 young sons, insists to this day that the killer was an intruder. The jury did not believe her. Why? Because of a home video shot 3 days after the funeral. A video that showed her spraying silly string on the boy's birthday cake at the gravesite. A video that, the prosecutor argued, proved she did not love her children enough to mourn them properly. Was that video the truth of who she was? Or was it the worst possible 8 minutes of her life, edited by a prosecutor to create a conviction? I am Miles Ghost Hunter. Sleep carefully. The phones are always listening.